Every year, the government's budget shapes the future of education in South Africa, and decisions to cut budgets, like the education budget, have huge implications for children's rights and futures. In this video, we explore an important question: are education budget cuts lawful under human rights law? The government's budget is not just about numbers, it's about people's rights. When it comes to education, these budgetary choices aren't just policy decisions, they're subject to legal obligations. South Africa's constitution and international human rights treaties create clear requirements for how the government should budget for education. The priority given to the right to basic education in the constitution is no accident. The right to basic education is a multiplier or empowerment right. This means it acts like a key for unlocking other rights. Let's explore key legal principles that apply to education budgeting. Immediate realization. In South Africa, the right to basic education is immediately realizable. This means the government must take reasonable and effective steps to provide quality education now, not gradually over time. Government departments cannot rely on resource constraints, in other words, saying they do not have enough money as an excuse for failing to provide quality basic education. It is their responsibility to make the case to Treasury for funds they need and to use those funds well. Enough funding must be given to fully realize the right to education. Non-discrimination. The obligation of non-discrimination applies to how the government allocates funds and spends money on education. It means that budgets must not unfairly burden or benefit particular groups. This applies even if the unfair discrimination is intentional or unintentional. Special attention must be given to historically disadvantaged groups. Non-retrogression. Non-retrogression means that the government must not take backward steps in realizing the right to education. This principle says that unjustified cuts to education budgets are not allowed. It says government must, at very least, keep the education budget big enough so that the quality of education is not made worse. Demands protection of education funding even during economic downturns. What are the courts saying? The principle of non-retrogression has been recognized and confirmed by the South African courts.
The National School Nutrition Program case brought by Equal Education, represented by Equal Education Law Centre, and the school governing bodies of 2 Limpopo schools.
In this matter, the court found that the failure to make sure all qualifying learners received their daily school meals during the COVID-19 pandemic was a violation of children's rights to basic nutrition and education. The court relied on the principle of non-retrogression, saying that government could not take away learners' right to basic nutrition, which is necessary to access the right to basic education, without a very good reason. The courts have also found over and over again that the failure to take reasonable measures and dedicate available resources towards the realization of socio-economic rights is unlawful. Where a socio-economic right is in play, an argument by government that it has not budgeted to meet its obligations will not be accepted as an excuse. It is even harder to justify failures to dedicate resources towards children's rights and other immediately realizable rights, like the right to basic education. We can apply the same reasoning to the national budget itself. The budget, like all other areas of law and policy, must be inspected carefully to see whether it meets constitutional obligations. Now, let's apply this to education budgets. Our Constitution guarantees the right to basic education as an immediately realizable right. This creates a high standard for government budgeting. But we've seen concerning trends in recent years. Education share of the total budget has stagnated. The amount of money spent per learner has gone down in real terms when it takes inflation into account. Infrastructure backlogs persist especially in rural areas. Cuts to education budgets arguably violate South Africa's human rights obligations. Let's see how these budget cuts impact learners and teachers and how these impacts relate to legal principles we've discussed. Immediate realization. Education's share of the total budget has stagnated and per learner spending has decreased in real terms when we consider inflation. This directly violates the principle of immediate realization. For example, budget cuts limit provinces' ability to hire teachers, leading to overcrowded classrooms. This particularly affects no-fee-paying schools and hurt the most vulnerable learners. Non-discrimination. Budget cuts deepen existing inequalities in the education system. While wealthy, fee-paying schools can use school fees to make up for cuts, under-resourced, no-fee schools cannot. This unfairly burdens historically disadvantaged groups, primarily black learners in rural areas and townships, learners with disabilities, and children from low-income households. These cuts worsen education inequalities that come from the legacy of apartheid and add to issues like poverty and unemployment. Non-retrogression. The decrease in per-learner spending represents a clear backward step in realizing the right to education. Early childhood development, or ECD, is particularly hard hit. A daily subsidy for low-income learners hasn't increased since 2019 at just 17 Rand per child per day. Inflation means this already very small amount is actually shrinking. Of that 17 Rand, only 6.80 Rand is meant to cover a child's food for the entire day. This is a key example of retrogression. Resource allocation. Even though many of the deadlines that say when schools should have proper infrastructure have passed, thousands of schools still don't have enough school infrastructure, especially in rural areas. The departments of education still have a long way to go, but education infrastructure budgets are decreasing. The limited ECD subsidy with only 6.80 Rand per day for a child's food shows inadequate resource allocation, failing to meet the standard set by court cases like Grootboom and Blue Moonlight, which say that budget constraints are not a valid excuse for failing to meet socio-economic rights obligations. These impacts aren't just inconveniences. They represent violations of learners' constitutional right to quality basic education. They particularly affect the most vulnerable learners, making existing inequalities in the education system far worse. Now we know that if government proposes cuts to education, it must prove that cuts were made only after considering all other options. This has not been done. There was proper and meaningful participation by affected groups in examining the proposed measures and alternatives. This has not been done. The most vulnerable learners are protected from negative impacts. This has not been done. Non-negotiable parts of the right to quality basic education, like access to a school, scholar transport, nutrition and textbooks, will still be fully met. This has not been done. We also know that increasing the education budget will not fix all the problems in education, but allocating enough resources is a non-negotiable first step. Enough funding ensures that, at very least, meeting the right to basic education is possible. Without proper financial commitment, even the best policies and intentions cannot overcome the hurdle of insufficient resources. Now let's address some common misconceptions about education budgets. Myth 1. Austerity is the only option to reduce government's debt. Fact. One way government tries to justify budget cuts is by saying that the country is in too much debt and does not have enough money. They argue that budget cuts will bring us out of debt and grow the economy, but the state has an obligation to mobilize resources through progressive tax policies and exhaust all avenues to obtain more funding for its human rights obligations. After over a decade of austerity with little progress, it's clear that alternatives must be considered. Myth 2. Underspending justifies budget cuts. Fact. Underspending often results from poor oversight and inadequate planning. The solution is to improve management and ensure proper staffing, not to cut budgets further and punish the most vulnerable learners. Myth 3. Increasing education funding means cutting other essential services. Fact. This ignores how deeply interconnected rights are. For example, adequately funded child support grants and public health services positively impact school attendance. In turn, better education unlocks other rights like equality, dignity, and improved health outcomes. It's about fulfilling all rights, not choosing between them. The truth is, if government truly sees human rights as non-negotiable, they will find ways to fund them adequately. It's about political will and making the right choices for children's futures. In conclusion, let's be clear. Government is balancing budgets by bankrupting children's futures. This is not just short-sighted. It's a violation of the Constitution and children's rights. Any budget that undermines children's rights deserves intense scrutiny and challenge. Join us in calling on government to 1. Reverse the trend of stagnating education budgets and declining per-learner spending. 2. Ring-fence education funding to prevent reallocation during economic downturns. 3. Implement a comprehensive human rights impact assessment for education budgeting. 4. Ensure that education and other social spending are protected from austerity measures. 5. Develop clear guidelines for applying human rights principles in budgetary processes. We must ensure that South Africa's tomorrow isn't sacrificed for today's bottom line.